Shabbat Shalom, everybody. I watched a movie this year that was based on a book entitled, What is a Life Worth? The book was written by Kenneth Feinberg, and many of you may recall that Ken Feinberg was appointed Special Master of the United States government for the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund. The September 11th Victims Compensation Fund was established by an act of Congress, commonly referred to as the Zadroga 9/11 Health and Compensation Act. And it was created in order to provide compensation for individuals who had suffered a physical illness, injury, or death as a result of the terrorist attack on 9/11. In which airplanes crashed into the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, leaving aside the problem of why Congress felt responsible to compensate victims and their families of an attack by an outside entity. I do want to focus for a minute on what is the value of a human life and what does it mean to be able to compensate somebody for one. In this film, there are a number of discussions that highlight the challenges of affixing a price tag to a human life. I'll just share one of them. Stanley Tucci is playing a a real-life person named Charles Wolfe. In a calm but agitated manner, he says, "My wife died that day, and everything about the formula," and that is, he's referring to the formula on how they decide on how much each person's life is worth. He says, "My wife died that day, and everything about the formula offends me." Michael Keaton, who is playing Kenneth Feinberg, responds, "Sorry to hear that, but we can't bend the rules for every case," suggesting, of course, that every human life has to be valued at the same price. Wolf retorts, "Why not? Congress gives you broad discretion. But when 7,000 citizens ask you not to be treated like numbers on a spreadsheet, you act like it's the law that has come down from Sinai." Leaving aside this idea of laws that come down from Sinai. Is there a price tag that can be put on a human life? And the answer is most certainly not. We can never, says our tradition, put a number alongside a person. That's why we don't count people. That's why the act of tattooing our arms in the Holocaust was one of the greatest indignities in humanity. To be reduced to a number is to misunderstand the complexities, the depths, the nuances of being human. And therefore, that is one of the great inhumanities. That's why the last plague that we read this morning is not about numbers of people, it's about individuals who died. And it wasn't until this one individual and his death was felt by Pharaoh that there came to be a realization that every individual was worth something. That it wasn't about, this time for Pharaoh, a nation suffering. It wasn't about a nameless, faceless crowd. It was about one child and a face he recognized. Yet there is a moment right before the final plague of the death of the firstborn that occurs during the plague of darkness that bothers me so much this week. And it's seemingly for the exact same reason. And it's this morning I want to call out a moment, maybe it's a lapse in judgment, but certainly a criminal act on the part of the Jewish people. As the Jews are getting ready to leave Egypt, there's one almost indecipherable instruction. says as follows, Daber na be'oznei ha'am, speak to the Jewish people. Vayishalu ish me'et re'ehu, v'isha me'et re'uta, kli chesed u'kli zahav. God instructs the Jewish people to ask of their neighbors, seemingly nicely, if they would be okay with giving over, let them borrow some of their silver and gold on their way out of Egypt. We know there was no intention of borrowing, and we're not even quite sure if the Egyptians responded in the affirmative, saying, sure, go ahead. The text simply says, tell the people to borrow, each person from their neighbor, objects of silver and gold. And I wonder, who are these neighbors about whom the Torah is speaking? Was it true that Jews were living alongside Egyptians? And then the second question was, who were they really borrowing it? Were they really borrowing it? Or were they taking it permanently? Did they have an intention, the Jewish people, once they became free, became a full nation, that they would then repay this gold and silver that they borrowed? According to our common reading of the text, the neighbors are the Egyptians, who have enslaved them, who have deprived them, who have taken away their human dignity, who have treated them like second-class citizens, and over time took their land and took their property. Which leads us to the next conclusion. And that is, were they borrowing this material at all, or were they simply, in their minds, taking it back? Were they taking what was rightfully theirs? Maybe that's an explanation at its best. At worst, were they saying, you owe us this, and therefore we will take it in the darkness of night, and in an action of looting? Did they say to themselves, this belongs to us in the first place because of the injustices that have been suppressing us? The most confusing part of the verse is vayishalu. This word, which you know means to ask of them. Like it or not, this is a difficult moment. And I can't make sense of this word vayishalu. I can't imagine a scenario in which the Jewish people said very nicely, would it be okay with you if we borrowed your silver and gold? Just ask nicely, says God, and they'll, of course, respond. The same Egyptians who were blinded by the cruelty and the violence with which they suppressed the Jewish people would all of a sudden be swayed by words of kindness. Rashbam says absolutely. Rashbam, in reading this text, says absolutely. If you ask nice enough and the Egyptians are depleted enough by the plagues they endured, they would absolutely agree to give over their gold and silver. In fact, they would say, here, take it. As long as you're leaving, you can have whatever you want. As long as the plagues are going to end, then no matter what, you can have whatever you'd like. V'sha'ala isha mishkanta umigarat beita kli kesef ukli zahav usmalot. Each woman will borrow from her neighbor and the lodger in her house objects of silver and gold and clothing, and they'll put them on their sons and daughters. It was a fair exchange, says Rashbam, and I say that's ridiculous. I hate to disagree with such an awesome mind and with a plain meaning of the text, but it seems to me impossible. They had no intention of borrowing the silver, the gold, and all the other luxury items with which we see in the desert experience. The skins and the fabrics, the wood, none of which was found in the desert, none of which could have been found in the desert, were all taken from the Egyptians. They had no intention of borrowing them. We were stripping the Egyptians of their wealth because they could and they did. And I'll tell you honestly, it's not something of which I am proud. We all have to do an accounting of things for which we are responsible, whether they be individually or as a nation. There has to be an accounting of our actions. And we can't rewrite history so that it sounds as though everything is hunky-dory, that everybody is kind and loving, that people give over freely because of wrongs they did in the past. Yeshayahu ben Avram Alevi Horowitz teaches something bizarre on this week's Parsha. He says there are 4 reasons why the Jewish people were redeemed. Why he brings that midrash in this location is something quite remarkable in my opinion. He says that there were 4 reasons why the Jewish people deserved to be redeemed. Not because of a covenant that God made with the Jewish people and was living up to at this moment, but because the Jewish people did something for which they warranted liberation. Shelo shinu et shemam. The Midrash says they never changed their names. They didn't take on Egyptians' names. Shelo shinu et lishonam. They didn't give up the Hebrew language. They continued to speak Hebrew in the face of an Egyptian culture. V'shelo haya bahem lashon hara. And because they didn't gossip. And finally, shelo haya bahem perutz be'erva. And they weren't promiscuous. Can you imagine this enslaved group of people were so virtuous that they deserve to be redeemed? Leave that aside. It's my question of why Horowitz brings that midrash here on this verse. I think it's because he writes one of the major books of Musar, Shnei Luchot HaBrit, in which he claims the necessity for us to be a virtuous people. And it's by way of virtue that we become redeemed. The challenge is, what's it doing on this verse? When clearly the actions of the Jewish people were not virtuous. When clearly the actions of the Jewish people in this location was, in my opinion, criminal. Horowitz is trying to say, no, we're not unethical. We are a values-driven people. He is doing exactly what we all do all the time. We justify, we defend, we rationalize. Yet the problem still remains when we have finally looked ourselves in the mirror and we do an honest assessment of our role in the pain of others, we must find a way to rectify whatever we can. I say that as individuals, but again, I say that as a nation. The further I looked, the more frustrated I got with our rabbis for not using their prophetic voice to call out Jewish people acting poorly. Just like the prophet Jeremiah did in this morning's Haftorah, just like the prophet Isaiah and Joshua have done for so long, we need to call out our own inaction and our own injustice. Maybe it's the idea of reparations that has us so conflicted. Wouldn't it be great if there was a simple formula in which we could exchange money for the suffering that we have inflicted on others? Wouldn't it be great If we could do exactly what the Germans thought they were doing at the end of World War II, paying reparations to our people for the injustices they committed against us, would that it would be enough that a couple Mercedes-Benz could be offered to the state of Israel so that they might become taxi cabs, so the Germans can feel better about their own actions. The word reparations comes from the word repair. It's a word we introduced to the world when we said, Litakein olam b'malchut Shaddai, that we have to repair the world in the kingdom of God. We know the words. We have a social action tikkun olam group in our community for the purpose of making our world a better place. And we have to begin with ourselves. And today, now, I speak not just of ourselves as individuals, but I speak of ourselves as a nation born of two, I believe, original sins. The sin of slavery and the sin of robbing and massacring an indigenous people. It is well time our country find a way to repay, to repair, to fix, litakein, the injustices we have created in the birthing of our nation. So I say, let's not paint a nice picture. Let's not make excuses. Let's live up to the power of our values. In the actual book that Kenneth Feinberg wrote, he writes the following: life's unfairness is usually the real source of their anger. The nature of compensation received is secondary. We need to do the real soul searching for how we address the issues of race in our country. But that's just the beginning. Think about it. In 1964, Poitier, who passed away just yesterday, had become the first black person to win the Best Actor Oscar. And these were the words that he said when he accepted his Oscar for a lifetime achievement. In 2002, he remarked, "I arrived in Hollywood at the age of 22 in a time different than today's. A time in which the odds against my standing here tonight, 53 years later, would not have fallen in favor. But back then, no route had been established for where I was hoping to go. No pathway left in evidence for me to trace. No custom for me to follow." And he continued, "Yet I stand here this evening at the end of a journey that in 1949 would have been considered almost impossible, and in fact might never have been set in motion were it not for the untold number of courageous, unselfish choices made by a handful of visionary American filmmakers, directors, writers, and producers, each with a strong sense of citizenship responsibility to the times in which they lived, each unafraid to permit their art to reflect their views and values, ethical and moral, and moreover acknowledge them as their own." Let me repeat those words of Sidney Poitier. May he rest in peace. A strong sense of citizenship and responsibility, unafraid to permit their art to reflect their views, their values, ethical and moral, and moreover acknowledge them as their own. That's what I ask of us today. To acknowledge our own sense of values and ethics and morals, and to let them be reflected in our actions no matter where we see injustice, past, present, or future. That's our mandate. That's our obligation. Think about it. Shabbat Shalom. Continue with Musaf, page 184. Please rise.